Hello and welcome to this broadcast of SBN Newsmakers. I'm Steve Lubetkin. Growing up in Oceanport in Monmouth County, we lived right across the street from one of the nation's most significant military bases, but it wasn't famous for its guns or other weaponry. Fort Monmouth was for nearly 100 years the home of the U.S. Army's Signal Corps. That's the unit of the Army that's responsible for all kinds of communications, tools, and technologies. My parents both worked at Fort Monmouth. My mom worked in personnel security, doing the paperwork for thousands of military and civilian employees to get their clearances to work with secret information and programs. My dad was an instructor, first in the photo division, teaching photography to soldiers and Defense Department employees. Then, for the rest of his career, he worked in what they used to call the Charm School, the Instructional Methods Division, where future communications instructors learned how to be effective teachers so they could extend the Signal Corps training programs to others after leaving Fort Monmouth. Now, Fort Monmouth closed in 2011. Its missions were dispersed to other military bases around the country. Soon, the base property will become energized once more as Netflix redevelops a large portion of the base that straddles Oceanport, Eatontown, and Tinton Falls into a major motion picture and television production studio. But at least one historian is making sure that Fort Monmouth's roots in producing some of the amazing communications technologies that we take for granted today are not forgotten. Melissa Ziobro is the Specialist Professor of Public History in the Monmouth University Department of History and Anthropology. Melissa was the last command historian at Fort Monmouth before the base closure in 2011. She's now the author of a newly published book about the history of the military base. It's called Fort Monmouth, the U.S. Army's House of Magic. You can see a link and a QR code for more information about the book on screen. Melissa is also the curator of the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music at Monmouth University. She's the current president of Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region, and for many years she served as the editor of New Jersey Studies, an interdisciplinary journal that's a joint venture of the New Jersey Historical Commission and Rutgers and Monmouth Universities. Melissa's a trustee of the New Jersey Vietnam Veterans Memorial Foundation, the Ocean County Historical Society, the Monmouth County Historical Association, the Info Age Science and History Museums at the Camp Evans National Historic Landmark, and Preservation, New Jersey. Melissa, thanks for joining us on the broadcast. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. Congratulations on the book. And what is the significance, in a nutshell, of Fort Monmouth in the history of technology and science and its impact on Monmouth County in general?
Oh, my goodness. When the base closed in 2011, and I had to pack up the archive and send it down to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, I was so sad because I understood that the Army felt this was their history and they wanted to take it with them so they could continue to celebrate it, in their new home there. But I also felt this was New Jersey history. And as someone who was staying behind as a lifelong New Jerseyan, as a lover of New Jersey history, I wanted to make sure that New Jersey continued to know and to celebrate this history, because the 90-plus year history of Fort Monmouth is not just military history. It impacts the way we all live our lives today, right? So, the history of Fort Monmouth from 1917 forward was about training Signal Corps soldiers, right? And later other kinds of soldiers, not to get down into the weeds, but to train soldiers for war, but also to innovate technologies that would save lives on the battlefield. Now, those technologies then made their way into everyday life. So when we look at things like weather forecasting technology, cell phones, GPS, in one way or another, they all kind of trace their roots back in part to the technologies that were being developed at Fort Monmouth. And that's something that, again, we as New Jerseyans should all want to know, should want to own, should want to celebrate.
Now, I know from my own experience, both of my parents worked at Fort Monmouth for many years, that it was a center of innovation and all kinds of technologies. And one of my favorite times was to go to the base on Armed Forces Day when they put everything on display. And I wonder if is any particular technology that you think is the most significant, aside from the carrier pigeons, which I'd like to get to in a moment.
Oh, good. I'm glad we're going to talk about the pigeons. Everyone loves the pigeons. But the reasons the pigeon service is discontinued in 1957 is because the technology had come so far. So initially, when Fort Monmouth starts out, what's actually Camp Little Silver, Camp Alfred Vale, and then Fort Monmouth. But when the base starts in 1917, some of the earliest technologies they are working on are air-to-ground radios. So from radios to radars to communications satellites to man's first contact with the moon in Project Diana to weather satellites, we could go on and on and on, to the counter-IED technologies that the fort was working on at the time the base closed. It's really hard to pick one and say this is the most important contribution because there were just so many. When I was writing the book, that was one of the things that I agonized over. You get a contract with a publisher, and Brookline Books, my publisher, has been just amazing. They're a local history subsidiary of Casemate Books. But they give you, your word limit, and I'm thinking, oh goodness, this could be a 10-volume series, right? Because so much has happened there at the base over the years, and I didn't want to leave out any technology that might be particularly important. You mentioned Armed Forces Day, and Armed Forces Day was when, one of the many opportunities when the base would open its doors to the community and kind of show off what they were working on, right? But when you do that, you have to relay it in a way that the average person who perhaps doesn't have a technical background can understand. And some of the work can be very difficult, right, to understand. So that's something I wanted to do with the book too, is make sure that it was written it's for everyone, but particularly for New Jerseyans who don't have a military background, who don't have a scientific background, for them to understand in simple, engaging terms all of the contributions of the base and the men and women, military and civilian, who worked there for so long.
So when you talk about the base origins and you talk about the carrier pigeon service as being one of the first communications technologies, in the book you mention correspondence from a Vietnam veteran who wrote to the base and suggested that maybe they should be using carrier pigeons in Vietnam. Tell us a little bit about the origins of the pigeons and then how it got into the Vietnam era.
As I said, everyone loves the pigeons. So, pigeons being used to relay messages. This goes back to ancient times. It's not something that, the U.S. Army Signal Corps invents, but the U.S. Army uses pigeons to relay messages very successfully in World War I, World War II, and Korea. And from the end of World War I forward, the Army's pigeon breeding and training section will be headquartered at Fort Monmouth as the home of the Signal Corps at the time. So these pigeons were known to be incredibly reliable. They have a great success rate. They are trained to fly under cover of darkness. They are trained to fly two-way missions. There are pigeons who, they would track the pigeons' service records. And there are hero pigeons who get medals. When a quote-unquote hero pigeon passed away, they were often taxidermied. There are taxidermied pigeons from Fort Monmouth living at museums around the country today. Cherami is at the Smithsonian. G.I. Joe is, I believe, at the Army Heritage and Education Center. But as I noted earlier, by 1957, the radios, the other technologies had come so far that the Army decides to do away with the pigeon service. At that time, as I said, the hero pigeons who had passed away, they were taxidermied and, sent to museums around the country. Hero pigeons who were still alive, they were sent to zoos across the country. And it was a big to-do for your local zoo to lobby to get a hero pigeon from Fort Monmouth. And then your average old, pigeon was sold for $5 a pair. There are photos of people lined up outside Fort Monmouth as far as the eye can see to get a pigeon and take that pigeon home. Now, you mentioned this letter from Vietnam. I bring this story up a lot because it is hard, as I noted earlier, to name your favorite innovation or what you think is the most impactful innovation because there were so many. Or people will ask me to name my favorite item from the old Fort Monmouth archive. It's hard, right? It's like picking your favorite child. You can't do it. But if I have to pick one of my favorite, it's this letter. It's a handwritten letter from a soldier deployed to Vietnam. And he's writing back to command leadership at Fort Monmouth. And he's like, listen, all of these radios and all of this other high-tech stuff you're sending us is great. But, the batteries die or the water messes it up or it gets sand in it, whatever the problem is. Can we just get some pigeons? Because the pigeons don't have those problems. And I love that letter because I think it's so human. I'm always looking for the human side of history. But it shows that the men in the field really knew about and trusted and respected the pigeons.
And I'm going to guess that they did not adopt that suggestion.
They did not. I was just looking at a book the other day. It's a book of Vietnam photography, and somebody had a pigeon. And I said, hey, wait a second, where did you get that pigeon? And I was talking to some Vietnam veteran friends of mine, and they were like, sometimes the units would find pigeons and try to kind of reinstate their own informal pigeon program. But the Signal Corps does not reinstate the pigeon program formally now.
So the base closed in 2011 and is about to be transformed into a major production facility for Netflix for video and motion picture content. There are some physical features of the base that people probably wonder about. What's going to happen to them? How is the historic nature of the place going to be preserved in some way as the development goes forward? And the one that comes to my mind most of all is what is now the extension of County Route 537, which when the base was in operation was referred to as the Avenue of Memories, with the trees planted along the way and the memorial plaques. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so, everybody thinks about Netflix and the redevelopment. I want to give so much gratitude and appreciation to the caretaker workforce that the Army left behind, led by my good friend, retired Lieutenant Colonel John Acapinti, who then kind of transitioned the property to the FEMIRA, the Fort Monmouth Economic Revitalization Authority. They've done such a tremendous job. It's a very, very difficult job, and you're never going to make everybody happy, but I think they have done such a tremendous job with the redevelopment thus far. And before Netflix even comes in, there's a lot happening on site. There are the repurposed officers' quarters where people are living. There's the Fort Athletic Club, which is, in the footprint of around Woods Hall, which was the base athletic center. So they've done a great job already. And of course, Netflix is going to move in. You bring up the question of the memorials. This was something that was of great concern to me as the base was closing. My office, the Command Historian's office, held the fort's Memorialization and Tradition Committee records going back to the post-World War II era. So I was intimately familiar with all of the memorials on base, and there was over 100. Many of them, those Avenue of Memory markers you mentioned that mean thoroughfare through the base. There was a memorialization committee staffed with people from across the base who met to decide what would happen with the memorials. There was one Army regulation that said you're supposed to send them all to this depot in the middle of nowhere. Like that option. We talked about, could you send them back to the families of the individuals memorialized? That was very tricky for a number of reasons. How do you locate them decades later? Which family member would get to have the memorial? So that's tricky. Would you send them to other military bases? And some memorials did go to other military bases. For example, the Signal Corps Centennial Time Capsule went to Fort Gordon, Georgia, which took the mantle of home of the Signal Corps from Fort Monmouth at some point. Some of the memorials went back to local communities. We had something called the Breslin Memorial, which went back to Belmar and is actually at the Belmar Marina right now. Why Belmar? Well, Pat and Sandy Breslin were this local couple. They had like a boat rental, bait and tackle shop, and they would let soldiers come use their facility for free. And so there was a memorial to them, which went back to Belmar, right? So there was a lot of discussion and thought that went into what should happen to the memorials. So some dispersed, many stayed behind. I've got to say, back as we were planning the closure of the base, that concerned me greatly, because I always used to, no offense to Target, but I used to use the example, like, what if Target comes in and they just bulldoze everything? How can we ensure that they will take care of these memorials? Because anything left behind that wasn't taken care of was, to me, an immense disrespect, right? So I was worried about that. But so far, the FEMIRA and the folks who are moving into the fort have done a tremendous job of caring for those that were left behind. Again, the Avenue of Memories, which has these markers primarily to signal for soldiers of World War II, beautifully maintained. I thank the county. I give the county a lot of credit for that, because that is a county road now. There are other memorials that were clustered in two areas. One is kind of by, the firehouse, if anyone's familiar with the base. And there's another cluster on Greeley Field, which is the parade grounds. So they've made these kind of memorial parks of, other left behind memorials that are not along the Avenue of Memories. Also on the Greeley Field, the parade grounds, is this large World War II memorial viewing stand. So everything is accounted for thus far. I do still go check on them regularly. Everything's accounted for. Everything's in good repair. I actually have a book chapter coming out about the memorials specifically, which I'm very excited about. And my discussions with the folks at the FEMIRA, my understanding is that part of their agreement with Netflix is that Netflix must continue to honor and respect these memorials. So I'm hopeful for the future.
So as Netflix moves in, it's going to be a significant influx of construction activity and redevelopment. And then when they actually get into production, I would imagine a significant number of people employed in all of the different crafts that are associated with motion picture, film, and video production. What do you think is going to be the impact on Monmouth County in general, and certainly on the immediate local area around Fort Monmouth?
Well, I think it's going to be positive. I mean, I'm not a direct neighbor of the fort personally, so I imagine if you are living directly adjacent to the fort, you might have concerns, right? That very valid concerns that I'm not thinking of. But to me, one of my jobs as the command historian was doing oral history interviews with fort personnel who were tasked with implementing the closure, right? So I had a very intimate look at how the closure happened, like the BRAC process, and then once it was slated for closure, how that closure unfolded, in addition to just kind of documenting it for the archival record. Getting to do the oral histories was particularly eye-opening. And one of the biggest concerns was the economic impact, right? Because from the base's inception during World War I, it had been a huge economic driver. In my book, I make a point to talk about that from the very beginning. There are, laborers who are coming in and helping to build the base, initially and then throughout the years, the permanent construction project, for example, that starts in the interwar years. There are good paying jobs, civilian jobs, particularly for women on post from the very beginning. Then those people who are working, who are stationed, who are living at the base are out in the local community spending money. There are people coming to Monmouth County and staying and eating and shopping because they're visiting soldiers at the base. So that's going on from the very beginning. So the enormous financial impact on the community was there for 90 plus years. And then you take that away, right? That was one of the things that politicians in particular were arguing as a defense of the base when the BRAC decisions were unfolding. So I think there's going to be, a lot of jobs brought to the area, a lot of opportunity, similar to that which the base had previously bought. I also selfishly, so I'm a Monmouth University alum, and I have been teaching here since 2007. I actually had some overlap. I would work all day, full-time job at the base, and then come here and teach history classes at night because I'm that much of a history nerd. And then I was fortunate to move into a full-time role after the base closed. But I, as a hawk, I'm very excited and hope we can reestablish the pipeline that existed between Fort Monmouth and Monmouth University. Fort Monmouth would send employees here to continue their education. The highly experienced personnel at Fort Monmouth would come here and teach, and then Fort Monmouth alumni would go to the base and get jobs. So I'm hoping that we'll see something similar, this mutually beneficial relationship between Netflix at Fort Monmouth and Monmouth University.
And I know as a Monmouth alum myself, I know my dad actually took courses at Monmouth when he was working at the Fort.
Yeah.
And years later, when I got there, I actually took courses with some of the professors that he had. So,
Okay. Oh, see.
so there is a connection. Fort Monmouth had a connection to popular culture. In addition, aside from all of the breakthroughs in technology and communications tools, two events come to my mind as being sort of connected to Fort Monmouth. One of them is in the terrible years of the McCarthy era in the mid-'50s. Fort Monmouth was the subject of one of Senator Joe McCarthy's most famous investigations. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a rather dark period in the fort's history. McCarthy becomes convinced that there is a den of communist spies operating in the Signal Corps, particularly out of Fort Monmouth and its sub-installation at Camp Evans. He comes here. There are dozens of base employees who are accused, who are suspended from their jobs on very little to no evidence. So that's a dark and painful period in the base's history. They often have to spend huge amounts of money trying to clear their names. They are, I believe, almost every single one, ultimately, off the top of my head, I think if every single one is ultimately reinstated and cleared. But it's a dark period in the base's history. That's an area ripe for exploration. My former colleague, Wendy Rajan, is thinking about doing a book on that period specifically. Another point I'd like to make there is that many of the employees who were suspended were Jewish, right? And there's a conversation to be had about what role anti-Semitism may have played in those attacks.
Sure. And the other story that I remember as a child is in the early 60s when Fort Monmouth became the temporary housing for one of the first mafia informers, Joe Velaki.
Yes. So Joe Velaki, this mob informer, was held at Fort Monmouth briefly for his own safety. I have a whole article on famous Fort folks. So we have, Eleanor Roosevelt who visited.
Right. She was here a couple of times.
Yeah. Yep. Whitey Ford played for the Signalers baseball team. There's a quote from him about how much the Army expects him to work. And by work, I mean play baseball. Like the schedule is too grueling for him. We've had a lot of celebrity encounters. Some unfortunately, darker, like the McCarthy period, yeah. and then some a little more fun and allow us to indulge our pop culture.
And if I'm not mistaken, from our mutual friend Lee Mrowicki, who's the host of Radio Jersey, the TV show we do, or the radio show we do a newscast for, Whitey Ford was involved in the design of Dean Field, which still exists, the baseball field at Fort Monmouth. Any word on whether that field is going to be preserved?
I do not know their plans specifically for Dean Field. I know the marker was still there last time I checked, just a couple of weeks ago. I know that Greeley Field is slated to be preserved, but I don't know about the baseball field specifically. We'll have to look into that one.
Okay. And then the last piece of it is the nice synergy that you have as the curator of the Bruce Springsteen archive. And before we went on the air, you were talking about how Bruce Springsteen has a connection to Fort Monmouth. Tell us about that.
Yes. So there are actually many connections that I've been exploring. My husband and my two kids, I have two boys, 13 and 16, and their whole lives have been Fort Monmouth history, right? They will tell you I can make anything about Fort Monmouth. So, of course, now that I have moved into this role here at Monmouth as the curator of the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music, I've been exploring Bruce's connections to the base. They just keep presenting themselves. So he played at the fort several times over the years. I think some, viewers, listeners will know he played there, relatively recently in the 2000s because it provided a level of security that you couldn't get. If you're going to rehearse at Convention Hall, you're going to have crowds show up. If you rehearse on a secure military facility, there's a little more control over who can show up and who can stay. But interestingly, you can go back and you can find Bruce playing at the fort as a teenager. So at the Teen Club, I believe at Gibbs Hall, it's something that I'm currently exploring right now. One of my former colleagues, Floyd Hertwick, who went with the archive down to Maryland, just sent me Fort Monmouth, a base newspaper article from the 60s talking about Bruce playing at the Teen Club. Another connection, which I'm so excited about, I have an article coming out about this, hopefully in December. Let me ask you this, Steve. You're supposed to ask the questions, right? I'm going to put you on the spot. On the Born in the USA album cover, what is in Bruce's back pocket?
I'd have to look at the cover.
Are you going to edit this out? No. So a lot of times you ask people that, and they will say a red bandana. The Born in the USA album cover, 40 years old, comes out in 1984. It's Bruce. We're looking at his behind, really.
Right.
He's standing in front of a flag.
I can visualize the picture. I just don't. The detail is escaping.
It's an example of the Mandela effect. A lot of people will say that, no, it was a bandana. It's actually a red hat. Well, years ago, somebody just, brought this up. Fred Carl from InfoAge has mentioned this. Other people have mentioned it to me, like back when I was the Fort Monmouth historian. Hey, do you know that hat is from Fort Monmouth? And I'd say, oh, really? Oh, where's the proof? Historians always want proof. I've never really seen proof of this. The archives here actually has access to the hat. It's actually in an exhibit we're doing right now called Music America. We just wrapped up a 6-month tour at the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, Texas, and we're moving the exhibit to the Grammy Museum in Mississippi. So anyway, this hat, you look at it, it's a red hat. It's in his back pocket on the album cover, but he wears it a lot during the Born in the USA days. He's wearing it in the Glory Days music video. And it says Rembass on it, R-E-M-B-A-S-S. And some people have said, oh, maybe it has to do with a fishing company, I guess because of bass. But Rembass was a project at Fort Monmouth, remotely monitored battlefield sensor system. It's developed out of a need that McNamara expresses during the Vietnam War. He wants a sensor system to help
troops. This is
the
Secretary of Defense McNamara.
Correct, yes. He wants a sensor system that will help troops detect via vibrations in the ground, and of course I'm simplifying, but detect when there's enemy moving nearby. And so out of this desire from McNamara comes Rembass, which ultimately is deployed in full throughout the 80s, and different generations of it are still used today. So how could I prove this? How could I prove this? It seems like Rembass must be Rembass, right? It's not a common word. It's not a common acronym. But I was at InfoAge. If your viewers, your listeners aren't familiar, InfoAge Science and History Museums are at the Camp Evans National Historic Landmark in Wall Township. Camp Evans used to be a part of Fort Monmouth, and it closed in the 90s, and now it's this nonprofit. Amazing group runs it. But I'm there. I'm doing an oral history workshop with some older gentlemen who used to work at the fort over the years. And we break for lunch, and one of them gives me a Rembass hat, the twin to Bruce's hat. And he says, here you go. Here's your proof. This is a hat that RCA, the contractor, made and gave out to folks who were working on the team. So I know I've gone on too long with this story, but there's another connection. Not only did Bruce play at the fort many times over decades, from his teen years through the heights of his stardom, in his back pocket on the Born in the USA album cover is a hat that is directly tied to this Fort Monmouth project.
It just demonstrates, Melissa, the total impact on life in central New Jersey of this institution. It was, an amazing part of my growing up years. It was clearly an amazing and compelling part of your career history. And we're just really glad that you've shared it in the book and that you're able to continue to investigate. There's many more stories, I'm sure, to unfold. And we just thank you for taking the time to talk about them today.
Oh, thank you so much. There are so many things to brag about being from New Jersey, and Fort Monmouth is one of them. So I want everybody to know that piece of their Garden State history and love it like I do. We all owe a debt of gratitude to the men and women, military and civilian, who worked at the fort for so many years. So thank you so much, Steve, for giving me a few minutes today to talk about it.
That will do it for this episode of SBN Newsmakers. If you have comments or suggestions about our broadcasts, please email me. The address is steve@statebroadcastnews.com. For all of us here at State Broadcast News, I'm Steve Lubetkin. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you out there on the net. Take good care.